So at this point in the course, you of course already learned a lot about crucial Angular features that allow you to build feature-rich, highly interactive web applications with Angular. But to deliver really great user experiences, performance also matters. And when it comes to optimizing performance, one at least potentially important building block is lazy loading, and that's exactly what this section will focus on. And for that, we'll explore what exactly lazy loading is and why it might matter in your application. And we'll then take a look at the different ways Angular gives you for implementing lazy loading. We'll take a look at deferrable views, and we'll take a look at lazily loaded routes. And therefore, let's dive right in, and let's start with the important question: what exactly is lazy loading? So what is lazy loading in an Angular app? What does this term mean? Well, in the end, it means that you want to build your app such, or you at least want to consider building your app such, that certain pieces of the overall application code that you write are only loaded and executed when they're needed. So some code is only loaded and executed when it's needed. That's what lazy loading means. So the idea is that you don't load the entire code of the entire application up front, but instead, by splitting it into multiple chunks that are loaded on demand, you have the potential advantage that you have a smaller initial bundle size, which means less code needs to be downloaded by your website visitors initially, therefore hopefully leading to a faster startup time and a better user experience, whilst of course making sure that any missing code is being downloaded from the server that's serving the application when it is needed. So some parts of the application code are only loaded when they're needed. That's the idea behind lazy loading. And adding it to your application and implementing it correctly can therefore reap those benefits and can therefore lead to a better user experience. Now, Angular offers two main approaches you can use for adding lazy loading to your application. And these approaches are actually not alternatives to each other, but instead you can use both approaches in one and the same application if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. And the first approach is that you use routing as a lazy loading mechanism. Take this application which we built in this routing course section as an example. In there, we of course got a couple of routes. We got the main route here, we got the user tasks routes, and we have some sub routes there specifically, one for showing all tasks and one for showing this new task component. And even though this is just a simple demo application here, we could of course consider only loading the code that belongs to the tasks component and or to the new task component when it's needed. Because when I, as a website user, visit this page for the first time, and I end up on just the domain /nothing, so I'm not on some path here, on some nested route, but I'm just on the main page. If I do that, I of course can't see any tasks. I also can't see this new task form component. But at the moment, without lazy loading, all the code for the entire application and for all the components would already be loaded initially. So at the point of time where I load this website, the entire compiled Angular code is downloaded from the hosting server and is then executed in my browser. Now, of course, this is a very basic example application here, and there isn't too much code in this app anyways. So not using lazy loading here is no big problem. We can absolutely build this app without lazy loading. But as mentioned, we could consider adding it, and to practice this concept of lazy loading based on routes, we'll do just that. We'll build up on this application and we'll add routing-based lazy loading to it. Now for that, attached you also find my latest snapshot of this application so that we can all use the same starting point, and in the next lecture we'll now add this route-based lazy loading. So how could we add lazy loading based on routes to this application here? Well, first it's important to analyze for which routes lazy loading could make sense. And for example, this starting page probably is not a good candidate. Loading the code that belongs to this notask component lazily doesn't make too much sense because it's our starting page. So most users will probably end up on this route and therefore load this code anyways. And in such scenarios, lazy loading could actually be bad because the code wouldn't be part of the initial bundle, but would then immediately be requested by the browser once this page has rendered, leading to another request and actually delaying the time until the app is ready to go. So instead, typically, you wanna load the code for routes lazily if those routes are unlikely to be loaded right at the start of the application. And I would argue that this is the case for this tasks route here, for example. Because we only activate this route and load this component, and therefore also any components that might be used by this component and any other code that might be related to this component, we only load that if we actually select a user here. So at that point of time, this code is required. But that's not the case initially when we first visit this page. Therefore, adding lazy loading here would make sense, and that's therefore what we'll do. So how can we make sure that this tasks component here is loaded lazily? At the moment, it isn't, just to make that clear. Instead, it's loaded eagerly because we have this import up here. And whenever you import something with this import statement like this into a file, you're loading it eagerly. To use lazy loading instead, you should remove this component property from your task and instead use the load component property. And load component then actually wants a function instead of a value like the name of a class or anything like that. And this function should return a value produced by calling import as a function. Now I just mentioned that using import will load something eagerly, but that will only be the case if you use it like this. If you instead call import as a function like this, the thing you're importing will only be imported and the code that belongs to it will only be loaded when this code here executes. And since this is wrapped in a function, Angular will make sure that this overall function is only executed when this component here is activated. So therefore, the question now is what we have to pass to this import function. And the answer is a string that contains the path to the thing we want to import. Just as with the imports up here. So in the end, this path here. I'll copy that and add that here. Now this import function then will actually yield a promise. And a load component wants a promise, but a promise that returns something different than returned by this import promise. Therefore, you should call then here, and then pass a function to then, and that's now the regular way of handling promises without async await. And the function you pass to then gets a module, which simply is the file content of this file. This is what we refer to as a module. And this module then contains the things that are exported by that file. So the component and resolve user tasks. And here it's the component. I want to access. And that's basically it. That's how you switch this route from a route that loads its component eagerly to a route that loads its component lazily. With that, you can and should remove this import up here, and now we can give this a try. If we save everything and we open the developer tools on this running page and you go to the network tab here so that you can see any network requests sent by the browser, and you click on a user, you should see that a new chunk of code is being loaded. We have this new request here to this chunk something.js file. And if you preview the content there, you see that in there we got some code that was loaded now. And that proves that lazy loading is working, but at the moment, we're actually not getting too many benefits out of activating lazy loading here. Because we still have this resolver here, and here I'm importing some function that is actually imported from that tasks component file in an eager way. So therefore, we're actually still importing this tasks component file eagerly because I'm using this function without lazy loading. Now, how can you work around that though? Well, one way, which we can use here as a temporary workaround, is that we simply grab this resolve user tasks function, we cut this code, and remove the export statement here from the component file, so that this is a pretty lean file. And we then, for example, add this function here to our userroutes.ts file. Here, for example. Now you just must make sure that you also import all the missing types again. So I'll quickly do that and also import the inject function and the tasks service. And once you did that, you can entirely remove this import. Because now resolve user tasks is a function defined here, and therefore it's no longer imported from that tasks component file. And as a result, this tasks component file is now really loaded lazily. And it's not just this file that's loaded lazily, anything that's imported in this file and that's not imported by some other file already is now also loaded lazily. So with those changes made, if you save that, if you reload your application, the starting page there, and you have the network tab open, if you click on a user, you will again see some requests here, but now those chunks that are loaded actually contain more code. As you can tell if you take a look at the preview tab of those incoming responses. And they do contain more code because we did now properly implement lazy loading. And that's therefore also important. It's not enough to just use load component. Instead, it's also important that you don't have any other parts in your code that would still eagerly load the file you're trying to load lazily. But with that, we now would have properly set up lazy loading for this tasks route.